So good evening to all of you. My name is Esther Lupatin, and I would like to welcome all of you to Tel Aviv University's webinar on the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, the unfolding crisis special briefing. The webinar will focus on three main facets. First, we will focus on the Jewish dimension, how the war is actually affecting the Jewish community in Ukraine. Our first speaker and special guest is Mr. Boris Luchkin, who's coming from Ukraine, President of the Jewish Confederation in Ukraine, and also the Vice President of the World Jewish Congress. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Dinamo from the Center of Russian and Eastern European Studies at Tel Aviv University. She will provide her perspective and insights into the ideology behind the invasion. Why did actually Putin invade Ukraine? And what is the source of friction between Ukraine and Russia? Our last speaker is Dr. Tal Sadeh, who is the head of the EU studies at Political Science, the School of Political Science at Tel Aviv University. He will examine the economic implications of the war in the European Union and the West in general. And one of the main questions here will be, what is actually, how this war is affecting the relationship between the EU and its member states. After the presentations, of course, we will have time for Q&A. So let's start with our first speaker. We're honored to give the floor to Mr. Boris Luchkin, who's the president of the Jewish Confederation in Ukraine and vice president of the World Jewish Congress. Mr. Luchkin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear friends, from Jewish Confederation of Ukraine and me personally, I would like to express my appreciation of your desire to help us in our struggle against terrible invasion, which Russia started on February 24th, 2022, to Ukraine. My speech today is riddled with pain for the suffering of the citizens of my country. I want to appeal to the entire intellectual world, to the world of educational institutions in different countries, and of course, Tel Aviv University, through the context of Tel Aviv University, to oppose violence, aggression, and the destruction of democratic Ukraine. Ukraine was the largest Jewish country in the world and hosted a quarter of the world Jewish population. In the Second World War, as a result of what is now known as the Holocaust by bullets, over 1.5 million Jews were killed. Despite this devastating tragedy, Jewish life flourishing in Ukraine following the country's independence in 1991, and some Jews started returning to their homeland. Ukraine is a free and tolerant country where all religions are free to prosper. We have a Jewish president, and no far-right party has ever received more than 3% of votes in any election. Ukraine is the least anti-Semitic country of Central and Eastern Europe. We, as Jews, can freely live, pray, and run our communities in Ukraine. We are calling to peace-loving people all over the world to get mobilized to stop the killing of innocent people. Ukraine urgently needs humanitarian and medical aid support to defend the country and financial assistance. I want to demonstrate a presentation when you can see cruel and scary moments and statistics of the today inhuman and ferocious war which Russia started against Ukraine. As Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, the opposite of love is not hatred, it is indifference. We pray that you do not stay indifferent to the fate of the Jewish people of Ukraine. So let's start with this presentation. On the next slide, please. The Jewish community in Ukraine, as I told, amounts up to 200,000 people. By some figures, maybe 400,000 people. It's the fourth largest Jewish community in Europe, the 11th largest in the world. Next one, please. As of March 5, it's after 7 days of the war. Now figures are even higher. Over 2,000 civilians were killed, among them over 30 children. Over 7,800 injured, among them almost 900 children. The majority of them in big cities with large Jewish communities: Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zhytomyr, Mariupol, Chernigiv, Uman. Next one, please. Since the beginning of the conflict, over million people fled Ukraine, over 500,000 were internally displaced. Next one, please. No, another one. Next. Yeah. Now some examples of the situation in Ukrainian towns and cities. Umань, February 24th, the city where the tomb of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is situated, was attacked by Russian military. Next one. February 26th, Kiev fights took place only 600 meters away from Galitsky synagogue. Next one. February 26th, Kiev, schoolgirl and her parents killed by Russian saboteurs. She has Jewish friends in her class. Her brother and sister heavily injured. Next one, please. This is an example how Ukraine lives now. A Ukrainian mother, February 26, gives birth to a baby boy in a hospital basement in Kiev. By the way, it's already more than 400 new Ukrainians was born during last 10 days in such basements. Next one. Kiev residents and residents of Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and some other big Ukrainian cities, including Jews, spent nights and days sheltering in basements and metro stations. Ukrainian railways introduced free evacuation trains. People, including Jews, are waiting for hours for their turn and are under constant risk of being hit and injured as a result of military attacks. On March 1st, there was a direct missile attack on the TV tower situated near the Babi Yar in Kiev, which is a tragic memorial of the World War II and the world symbol of the Holocaust. 5 civilians were killed and 5 more injured as a result of this attack. Kharkiv is under constant fire of Russian artillery. People are trapped in shelters. It's also hard to evacuate. The railway station has been bombed. This is humanitarian catastrophe. 1.5 million people live in Kharkiv. It's the second largest city in Ukraine, including up to 45,000 Jews. Small cities under Kiev, Bucha, Borodyanka, and Irpin are destroyed by the Russian military. Tens of civilians killed, hundreds, including Jews, are living in shelters without food and water supply. This is really humanitarian catastrophe. March 2, Zhytomyr, living quarters and the maternity hospital were under attack in the night. Next one. March 2-5, Yakovlevka village, Kharkiv region. All 45 private houses of the village where civilians, including Jews, lived have been destroyed or damaged as a result of the continuous Russian missile attacks. No military objects are situated nearby. This is, I think, the photo which we will see in big exhibitions of best photo of the year. It's 2 days ago in Irpin, near Kiev. Hundreds of civilians, including children, women, elderly people, are hiding under the ruins of the bridge from the strikes of Russian artillery and aviation. The situation in Ukraine is extraordinary. It's the first time in the 21st century when one country with big Jewish community tries, invades the other. What is absurd, Russia declares that the war is against the Nazis for denazification in Ukraine. The situation with anti-Semitism in Ukraine can be characterized as calm. Ukrainians are more tolerant to Jews. Compared to the previous decade, the intolerance against Jews has decreased significantly, and its level is currently one of the lowest in Europe. In 2019, there was a decrease in the level of anti-Semitism in Ukraine by 27%. In 2020, the level of anti-Semitism in Ukraine remained unchanged. It's a report by the United Jewish Community of Ukraine. Percentage of adults who say they would not accept Jews as fellow citizens. In Russia, 14%, in Belarus, 13%, in Poland, 18%, and in Ukraine, just 5% by survey Pew Research Center. What we need to do, we need to push on the state of Israel with your support to increase all possible types of assistance to Ukraine and use all available means of Israel to stop the war in Ukraine. The second, to provide, yeah, thank you. To provide every possible assistance to Jewish community in Ukraine, to help elderly Jewish people living in the home with the assisted living facility in Kyiv, to help Jews who are waiting in long queues to be evacuated from Ukraine, to support Jews who decided not to leave Ukraine and moved to stay in the Western Ukraine. It's also very important because Western Ukraine is now overcrowded by a lot of refugees from the Eastern Ukraine. Tel Aviv University, together with other universities of Israel and of the world, to make a strong statement calling Russia to urgently stop the war against Ukraine and humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine. And also Tel Aviv University and other universities of Israel to appeal to all Russian universities and scientists with whom you cooperate with the request to join the efforts aimed at stopping immediately the war in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Boris Luchkin, for your important update from Ukraine and also for the state of the Jewish community. I'm sure we learned a lot from you. And I'm sure there are so many questions really about the situation of the Jewish community in Ukraine and you know, possible future scenario. What's going to happen to them? Are they going to stay in Ukraine? Are they possibly going to migrate to Israel or maybe other European or maybe the US? But in the Q&A, we have questions for you and for the other speakers. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about the situation of the Jewish community in Ukraine. So thank you so much, Mr. Luchkin. I would like now to move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Dinamo. She's from the Center of Russia and Eastern European Studies at Tel Aviv University, and she will talk about the Russian perspective and the decision to invade and the ideology behind the invasion. Dinamo, we are very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you, Esther, and thank you all for joining us. And I want to thank our Friends Association and the Development and Public Affairs Division for inviting me. I think it is quite clear to everyone now that the events in Ukraine are more than a war between Russia and its neighbor. It's actually an event that consumes entire Europe and entire world. It's clear from the moment questions about NATO and Ukraine's possible joining of NATO appeared. And so it is indeed a question also of power struggle and economy and geopolitics. But in my words, in the few moments, I would like to address another aspect, which I think is crucial to understanding the crisis. And this is the Russian worldview of the events. And I think this defines how Russia acts. It can help us understand the range of possibilities that is there on the floor. But I also think that this reconstruction is crucial because it's actually an image of what Russia went through in the 20th century and maybe before. And actually this conflict is a reflection of this specific worldview, which is utterly different from the West. And this is one of the problems here. And so in the next minutes, I will describe what I think this worldview is, what the war is really about. And later, I think we could talk a bit about public opinion, some trajectories for the future. So in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke apart and its Union republics became independent, it seemed that the Cold War was over and the world is happily turning to be united. Capitalism, liberal democracy won over communism, and then Russia and the entire Eastern Bloc is supposed to join the West in its worldview. But however, this transition from communism to liberalism and the free market economy proved to be much more complicated than originally assumed. And while some states, like the Baltics, for example, managed to go through the transition relatively smoothly, others still struggle with undeveloped economy, corruption, political instability, and not less significantly, reshaping their new identity. I think here that identity politics is one of the key moments for understanding what was going on in these former Soviet republics, and particularly in Russia. Because each of these republics had to define anew their identity after the collapse of communism. So how should Russia define itself after 70-year-long revolution, after this turn to be a lie? Who is to be Russian now? How should Russian citizens deal with the national past of terror, of coercion? How should we explain all these lost lives? And while for Eastern Europe it was somehow easier because they could distance themselves from communism and from Soviet occupation, I think that for Russia, this was a real crucial question. And this is the reality Putin faced when he came to power in 2000, just 2 years after the crash of economy in Russia in 1998. So what should we pick for the Russian past in order to create this new identity? And World War II was marked as this great moment of Russia, what we can save from the Soviet past. The glorious victory over Nazism, saving the world, and heroism. And history books, everything was rewritten to target that without really facing the dark moments of Soviet history. So it is not an accident that after 20 years of emphasizing how this war was important and glorious, that in his speech, in order to unite people behind the Russian flag, Putin brings up this idea of denazifying Ukraine, of fighting this holy war against neo-Nazis. And this becomes one of the major moments that Putin wants people to follow him. But actually, other moments in Russian identity are problematic as well. We have to remember that for 70 years, or at least, but also during the Cold War, there were very tensions relations between the West and Russia. The confrontation around the revolution and the economy and capitalism was crucial for Russian identity for years. But even if we put aside Soviet history and go back to the Tsarist times, even then, Slavophile groups emphasized Russian unique character, unique way to modernity, which actually despised what they called false Western individual freedoms. So what do we do after all this collapses? Can we define a new Russian identity? And Putin's war with NATO, in my opinion, in what was one of his wars over this new identity, of the clinging of both Putin and groups in Russian society, we can discuss this later, who are rallying behind this old traditional identity. So the confrontation between Putin and the West is not only about how we should divide the world, because I think this discussion could end in a certain compromise of territory, of areas, of states. It is a debate about the very basic questions of how we're going, who defines how the world is, what are the rules of the world, how we're going to act in the future. And Putin's war is in this respect is much more profound and much more difficult to win and for the West to cope with, because it is not enough even if the West comes in and suggests different compromises. This is a totally different question. And this question of Russia's future clashes with what happens in Ukraine. because we have to remember that Ukraine, in the Russian perspective, is the beginning, the cradle of its becoming Kievan Rus. This is where Russia was born. And suddenly this nation, which the Russians for years tried to Sovietize or Russify during the 19th century, 20th century, maybe something Putin forgot, the fight of Ukraine for independence, also in the 20th century. It lasted for 10 years, from the end of World War II to the mid-1950s. And suddenly this state chooses a different path, a path that clashes with the true Russian identity, as Russia sees it. Again, not everyone, but certain groups that are influential around Putin, and Putin himself, judging from his speech. So around this clash, while Putin says he's going to save his Ukrainian brethren, they say they don't need saving. They see it as a war of independence, of nationalism. But I want to suggest another aspect. I want to suggest that this is actually a civil war. It's also a civil war of Russians over the future of Russia, its identity, and its regime. On the one hand, we can see people supporting Ukraine, its choice of liberal democracy, of freedom, of sometimes unstable moments of its regime, moments that Putin sees as scary. But this is the choice of the Russian people, and the Russians inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine watch it. And for Putin, it is also difficult to see Russian people supporting a different identity, a different choice. And so in this war, since this is not only a civil war, but also involves norms and beliefs that are clashing between Russia and the West. The West has also a certain role of realizing this clash and understanding that it's more than simple clash between geopolitics, powers, but something more profound. And every support that can be given to whoever is fighting for opening Russia to change or to a true dialogue that will take place in Russia over its identity, which of course goes through different developments from 1991, is something that we could embrace and support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina, for really providing such an important analysis and important glimpse of the Russian history, and really to understand, where we're coming from. So it's really such an important and fascinating topic. And I'm sure at the end, we will have a lot of questions about, and especially where are we going from here? What are the possible future scenario? And also about the public opinion in Russia, does he actually represent the public opinion or not? Are they supporting Putin or not? I'm sure there will be many questions about this topic at the end of the Q&A session. So thank you, Dina. And now we're going to move to our last speaker, Dr. Tal Sadeh, who is the head of the European program at Tel Aviv University, and who will talk about the economic implications of this conflict on the European Union, on the West in general. So Tal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Lupatin. So the invasion of Russia into Ukraine generated many fears that Russia will be able to take advantage of the relative dependency of the West on the supply of raw materials from Russia, especially energy, in order to neutralize any resistance to Russia's move, perhaps also in some other parts of Eastern Europe later. And Russia indeed is a very important source of energy for Western Europe, especially countries like Germany or Italy, which receive some 40% of their gas supply through a pipeline that starts in Russia. And Russia is an exporter of important other raw materials like wheat and iron, and provides essential elements for industry in Europe, especially in the car industry. And obviously, any severance of this supply, any disruption to this supply, especially sudden disruption, can neutralize industries in the West, make their products expensive, and rising food and energy prices will make it harder to get warm in Europe. This winter is about to end, but currently there are major efforts underway to secure energy for next winter. The potential is that the Western European public will be very discontent. But after all is said and done, this is a mutual dependency. And just as the West depends on these raw materials from Russia in the immediate term, Russia really depends on the money that flows in the other direction, because it doesn't have any other important income in foreign currency. And especially now that its central bank's assets are frozen, it really needs those $700 million a day that it receives for energy from the West. Russia doesn't have a serious electronics industry, for example. Whatever car industry it has is controlled by Western multinationals. Many of them have recently, in the past week, closed down their factories of cars in Russia. Russia doesn't have any meaningful chips industry. And in fact, it depends on the West for the imports of almost all of the things that are essential for modern life. Of course, Russia prepared for this move. It acquired large foreign currency reserves, but these are frozen now. It also converted about 20% of them to gold, keeping it physically in Russia, in order to finance perhaps this situation where it is almost under economic siege. But it's very hard to sell gold. Few people would accept physical gold unless you are the Spanish emperor of many centuries ago. This is not how payments are done today. And because Russia has no official access to currency markets, it cannot really even convert to gold. So this puts it in a very tight spot. And Russia has tried in the past to diversify and to try its own payment system, but it hasn't been successful. There are good reasons for it that I cannot cover now. It will not be able to accomplish it in a few weeks or even a few months. And over the immediate and longer term, Russia is in great disadvantage, in great dependency on the West. Some people suggest that China can step in and help Russia. And as I suggested, to the extent that Russia has been trying to diversify its economic partnerships, it has already done so, and whatever it has not achieved, it will not likely achieve soon. Yes, China can sell some of the things to Russia that the West used to sell. It will be fewer, less abundant, of lower quality at higher price, or else Russia would have been buying it from China long ago. And the West pays better, and China isn't really rushing to supply Russia where it can sell in the West. So I don't think that China will be of great help to Russia on the economic front. In the longer term, Russia cannot win another Cold War. It has already lost one when it was the Soviet Union. And in this Cold War, if this is what we are beginning now, the West arrives at a stage of affluence and technological advance. Western Europe of the 1940s was devastated, ravaged by nationalism, hunger. This is not the situation. This is not the starting point for this Cold War. Russia and China, for that matter, are behind the West in important crucial technologies like immunization, genetic engineering, space and aerospace, chips, computer operating systems, international payment systems. They're both aware of this disadvantage on their part. They're trying to do better, but it doesn't work for them. And as raw materials go, in the longer term, the West can certainly adjust. We should not forget that the combined agricultural and natural resource potential of the United States, Canada, and Australia, not to mention their area and population, are much greater than Russia's. And in a strategic world, you can expand growing things there, pumping, digging, that in an economic world were not profitable. But if this is about strategic consideration, then certainly the West has more resources than Russia does. Which brings me to the question of what is Putin after? Everybody's asking this. Is he not aware of this? We used to think of Putin as a very professional and experienced politician that takes calm and measured decisions, that perhaps consults with experts. Some of us are not really sure anymore. What is he trying to achieve here? It's not possible to stop Russia's war in Ukraine with economic measures, but the West is providing arms to Ukraine. It will most likely continue to arm resistance in Ukraine if it ever happened that the Ukrainian government should fall. If it was able to do so in Afghanistan in the 1980s, it would much be easier to do today in Ukraine. So I don't think Russia will ever be able to enjoy Ukraine if this is what Putin is trying to do. And attrition there will make it very difficult for Russia to pursue similar moves in other parts of Eastern Europe. There's just one account, one perspective in which perhaps Putin can win in this crisis, and that is in his fight against democracy. Until the invasion, Ukraine demonstrated to the world and to people in Russia that a Russian-speaking population can have a democratic system, a functioning democratic system that is not controlled by supporters of the Kremlin. I think Putin is very concerned about this example, a bad example from his perspective, and that he is trying to show that it only brings ruin on people. And whatever unfolds in Ukraine, I'm afraid that in this, he may achieve his goal to keep Russia non-democratic. So I think preservation of the Russian regime, I suggest, is the main motive here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tal, so much for really such an important insights and insightful comments into these economic implications, especially the long-term implications of the war, this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm sure I personally have so many questions, especially about the EU and, the implications, for the different member states of the EU because of this crisis. But of course, we will open it for discussion later on. We're actually opening to discussion now. So first, I would like really to thank all of you, all the speakers for important analysis and important insights into the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Now we would like to move to the Q&A section of this webinar. And our first set of questions are going to be, I will pose to Mr. Luchkin from Ukraine. And it's about, you talked a lot about the Jewish community and the situation of the Jewish community. And I have a few questions. I do have some questions, and also the audience have some questions about the future of the Jewish community. So I would like to ask a few questions. First, do you think that most Jews will stay or leave Ukraine? And if they're going to leave, are they going to live to Israel or possibly to Europe or America? What seems to be the preference? That's the first question. The second question, someone from the audience asked about, the American position. Do you think, in your opinion, that the Biden administration position vis-a-vis Ukraine was satisfactory, or they should have done more? And what other measures you expect, from Israel and also from the Western international community to do in order to protect Ukraine? The last question is about the refugees. I know that you are the vice president of the World Jewish Congress, and I wonder what's the position of the World Jewish Congress about Israel, admitting refugees and especially non-Jews to Israel. So.
Thank you. But I have two questions from my side.
Absolutely, go ahead.
First question to you. Why you call the situation in Ukraine as a conflict?
Conflict because it means that, you know, like this is a long-term process, you know, now we have a war, but eventually, you know, it started as a conflict. I mean, we've seen tensions between Ukraine and Russia for many, many years, you know, like in 2006 and 2014. So it's war, it's something which is very limited in time. Conflict, it's kind of a long-term thing. And that's what I see, you know, it's been going on between Russia and Ukraine in the last 2 decades.
So we understand that now it's a real war with a lot of...
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question to Dina. She told about civil war. What kind of civil war she told about?
That we're going to ask Dina afterwards, but it would be great if you can answer the questions about the Jewish...
Excuse me, I think it's crucially important for understanding the situation in Ukraine, you know. Okay, can we ask Dina to answer?
I actually hinted at kind of a civil war that we cannot really see between Russians among themselves. So it's actually Putin waging a war against Russians inside Ukraine because he doesn't want them to choose a different regime. So he's waging a war against Ukraine, but it's actually in the name of taking all the people that he believes belong to Russia. First of all, the Russians, because he will not let the Russians inside Ukraine choose a different regime. So he says, I'm saving them. Well, they don't need saving. And then he enters Ukraine in the name of this, you know, that he's talking about a problem between Russians and a certain group in Ukraine. But in effect, he's actually hinting at a civil war that is between Russians among themselves that he is not allowed to, that is not taking place in Russia because you cannot really speak freely there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry it was not clear in the first presentation.
Thank you, Dina, thank you. So about questions, the respected host asked first about Ukrainian Jews. Unfortunately, I think we are losing now big communities from Kiev, from Kharkiv, from Dnipro, etc. Of course, it's difficult to say now how long will these people live in other places. Some of them are making Aliyah, some of them are Israeli, but Israeli who lived in Ukraine for a long time and former Ukrainian. So I think that in worst case scenario, I think it's we will have, let's say, some mix of Syrian and Vietnamese war on territory of today's Ukraine. I think we will lose majority of our communities. Part of them will live in Israel, part of them will live in Eastern Europe, part of them will go to the US. Now, of course, it's difficult to say statistically the percentage, but I am afraid that we lose a lot of Jews from Ukraine, a lot of. And of course, we help them to evacuate, etc. But I'm afraid that a lot of them won't come back. About Biden position, you know, I have a public info. I don't have a lot of insight about the position of Biden administration, but anyway, they show their support of Ukraine by financial, humanitarian, defense aid. But I think that they will be more and more tough in this war. But the problem is that, you know, I'm afraid that we are on the verge of the World War III. And this is, I think, just maybe not the beginning, maybe it's the beginning, I don't know yet, but I think it's just one of the elements of the beginning of World War III. And this is the main issue important to understand also in Israel. So it's not local conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's at least a conflict between Russia and the West. And Dina was absolutely right that it's the consequences of the Cold War, consequences of the victory of the West, consequences of the Russia which feels that they are not at the table with the West, but I think it's not everything. I think it's just the beginning, and I think it will affect, and it's already affected all the world. And about refugees, it's a very important issue. You know, about Jewish refugee situation is good. So Israeli government made a lot. We have representatives of embassies in Poland, Romania, Hungary on border and in big cities. So it's quite easy now to make aliyah for Jews. So it's okay. But I think there is another very important issue for Israel. It's Ukrainian refugees which are not Jews. As for me, Israel should open borders for these refugees because Jews were in the same situation when Exodus, you know, came to Cuba in, I don't remember, 1940, yeah, or something like this, 1939. Yeah, and I think now the situation is quite similar. And okay, Israel don't send these people to Ukraine, but when some of Ukrainians, for instance, who needs some medical aid, etc., can't come to Israel, as for me, it's not correct. It's not the right position of Israel. Ukrainians won't be the bad part of Israeli society, and I don't, by the way, expect a lot of refugees from Ukraine, because for Ukrainians, logistically much easier to, and not only logistically, but by a lot of other reasons, easier to be in the Eastern Europe. But Israel should show for Ukrainians that if you want, you can come. And as for me, it's fair and important for Israel to show its real friendly face to Ukraine, because the level of support of Israel in Ukraine is very high. Ukrainians are very positive to Israelis, and in this really horrible situation, not to open borders for refugees from Ukraine, non-Jews refugees, it's not right decision. I call for Israeli authorities, I call for all participants of today's seminar to call to Israeli authorities to open border for Ukrainian refugees. It's important, you know, by a lot of existential issues as well.
Thank you so much, Boris, really for important things. And it's really unfortunate what you said about the fate of the Jewish community. The vast majority of Jews in Ukraine are not going to stay in Ukraine. And also about, you know, the humanitarian catastrophe, the fact that so many people are suffering, so many people have died so far. And by the way, Tel Aviv University, I don't know if you know that, but Tel Aviv University offers actually scholarships to Ukrainian students. So we're trying to do, at least to do our part, a small part. It's important.
We appreciate it. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And now we're going to move to Dina. And Dina, I have a few questions that, you know, my own questions, but also questions from the audience about what's happening in Russia today. We see a lot of demonstrations in Russia against the war. And my question to you is it representative of the general feeling of many Russians? Are most Russians against the war, or do they support Putin? That's my first question. The second question is about, assuming there will be negotiations to stop the war, what do you think are the minimal demand for Putin? In other words, what would make actually Putin leave Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. So the question about Russian public opinion is a very good one. The assessment, even people in Russia, is that sadly, many of them get their information from mostly the official TV networks and not necessarily from other sources of information. We know that during even the Crimea annexation, there was a support of like 50 or 70%. But now people actually, from what we hear, is that the tide is changing. And slowly certain pieces of information are coming from Ukraine back to Russia. It includes soldiers who speak up, and little movies that are translated and transmitted there, and about the soldiers that are saying we shouldn't have come here, this is not our place, if someone came to our home we would do the same. I heard even a soldier asking the Ukrainians to spare the lives of Russian soldiers so that they can go back and tell the truth in Russia, so that Russians change their minds about the support for Putin. We know that traditionally there was a very big group of the public supporting Putin, but there is also quite significant percentage of people that do get their information from the outside, who are critical of Putin. But again, we know that the repressions against these groups are very, very hard. But now there is an interesting move that even the people that were previously ready to be quiet and keep their deal of, their quiet lives, this war in Ukraine changed this, and simple people of culture, the cultural sphere, journalists speak up, and people do hope that with this, actually, they will be able to change public opinion. But more importantly, the more optimistic ones believe that even the people surrounding Putin will change their opinion.
Thank you so much, Dina. It's very interesting, and unfortunately, and hopefully we will see an end to this war anytime soon. I want to move now to Tal Sadeh and ask him a few questions about the economic implication. Tal, I have to say, when I first saw your title, I thought like, wow, that was very provocative. But it's interesting when you talk about really the long-term consequences, and it was really good analysis that you provided about the long-term implications, economic implications on Russia. But I have a few questions here. One of the questions, because you're an expert on the EU, you're head in the EU European studies, and I wonder, in your opinion, which country in Europe is likely, in the EU, is likely to suffer the most from the consequences of the war? One thing. And also, like, one question. The second question is about the economic sanctions. For the moment, we see that most European countries that, EU is coming up with restrictive measures, against Russia. Do you think that long term, there are going to be some countries, in your opinion, that might not follow suit and might actually decide not to actually impose sanctions on Russia because they are likely to, it is likely to have economic implications on their country? What do you think?
Thank you, Esther, for the compliments. So obviously, in the immediate term, the countries most exposed to economic damage are those that depend on imports of food and energy from Russia. And I've already mentioned Italy and Germany. But I see great resolve there. There is a clear understanding that something important has changed. I don't think leaders and the media and the public are regarding this situation as just another event with a dictator that can be paid off to leave them alone. There's a Bild, the major newspaper in Germany, came out with the headline, "Putin betrayed us." The Germans thought that by co-opting Putin for decades, that they were buying peace on the Eastern Front, but that has collapsed. And the talk in Germany and other countries is to rebuild their pipelines and their supplies away from Russia. There is a talk in this winter, as I said, is about to end, but in the next winter for consumption to be cut down by 15%, people to wear sweaters at home. The public is being readied to a national project of disconnecting from Russia. And I think this is genuine. And I think this is a longer term than you might think. And it also connects with internal politics in Germany. You have the Greens in government. They never liked this pipeline. They see Russia as a carbon power and as such is not part of the future. They never liked the deals of the other mainstream German parties with Russia. This comes from below. It's not just from above. So I think this is genuine. This is serious. And I think we should be impressed by the ability of the foreign ministers to be unanimous. But there's been a lot of talk about, how this country is unwilling to bear the burden of that country. But that's just part of the bargaining among them. Everybody wants to pay less for a public product, which is their security vis-a-vis Russia. But in the end, they're all in the same boat. And we have, they're all taking pains. They're all suffering. I see this major rise in security expenses in Germany is something completely different, a break with the recent past in Germany. So I don't see any weakening of the resolve or any of that thing. I think everybody is realizing that this is for the long term. When you have car companies shutting factories down in Russia, when BP walks away from $25 billion in Russia, this is very serious, very serious. And if you look at the corporate world and the seriousness with which Western multinationals are taking the situation, it's obvious that it's almost a consensus among management that there will be no serious business with Russia for a long time.
Thank you, Tal, so much. I do have a last question, maybe for you and Dina, and maybe like Boris would like to, but I think it's more about Putin's perspective, because Dina, you're an expert, in Russia and Eastern European studies, and I was wondering, and also maybe you, Tal, about what is actually, from Putin's point of view, assuming the negotiations will go on, eventually it will happen. What do you think are the Dina and the minimum demands from Putin? In other words, what would make Putin, in your opinion, leave Ukraine? And also, like, Tal, if you can talk about the economic things, is there anything that might actually, affect Putin, change his mind in terms of sanctions that might, make him leave Ukraine, or it's not going to happen anytime soon? So, Dina, let's start with you. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Well, I'm not an expert on what is going on in Putin's mind. I'm not sure anyone is. I know what happened or what what we can see from the outside. And there are two trajectories actually people are thinking about. One is indeed that we're facing a very gloomy future of Putin being so pressed to the wall that he could push that button and use other atomic energy, etc., and that nothing could actually stop him. But in the recent days, I was actually buying the more optimistic view, which actually ties in with the pressure that Tal was mentioning that is put on Russia. And the voices that are speaking about the more optimistic scenario is that actually whatever is the world uniting behind Ukraine will turn Putin to be irrelevant, so that whatever he wants or wishes it's actually irrelevant, because we should speak to the people around him, to the people that understand that they're going to lose this war, they're going to lose their economy. There is nothing good that faces Russia if it continues that path. And if we continue pressing situation and rallying behind Ukraine, then maybe we'll have a change of regime in Russia, a completion of this of the process of disintegration of the communist regime. And I think this could be a good prospect for the world, not only for Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Dina. Thank you so much. And Tal, and maybe Boris, last sentence, but Tal, I would like to hear you first.
Yeah, I don't think that this situation is going to be resolved anytime soon. I think Putin will escalate. We'll call the West bluff. I'm not sure where he's going to stop. I still think he's not an ideological decision maker. He's more of a cynical, pragmatic one. I think he's after power. So it has to pay. Anything he does has to pay in terms of power for him. And it's a question of what kind of payoffs he's confronted with. I certainly think there will be a lot more repression inside Russia. And a lot of people will be paying for this war, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia. The threat for Putin will be from his circle, his kind of, we used to say semi-authoritarian, I think we can speak simply of authoritarian regime now, is based on a rather large circle of people who enjoy and cooperate. And I think as sanctions bite, it's going to hard to spare them of the damage. At what point will they decide that they want to replace him? I don't know, but I think currently this is the most likely scenario for ending this situation, but it's not going to happen very soon. I do not want to sow despair, but we're in this for some time now, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Tal. And Boris, our special guest from Ukraine, what do you think? Is there anything else you would like to add?
Unfortunately, I think that the more pessimistic view is more realistic in this situation, and I'm afraid that they will continue to escalate the situation, and we'll have more killed people and more refugees. But of course, it will affect Russia as well, and Russian people.
Thank you so much. Really, I would like to thank all our speakers, and I really hope that the war, this conflict, will come to an end very soon. But in the meantime, I would like to thank our speakers for their fascinating and so interesting analysis into the situation. I would like also, of course, to thank Tel Aviv University, and especially the Division of Development and Public Affairs Division at Tel Aviv University Friends Association around the world. And also to you, of course, to our audience for attending this webinar. And of course, we look forward to seeing you in our future events. So thank you so much for all of you.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you. Thank you very much.